The studio lights were warm, the audience was buzzing with mild anticipation, and the cameras moved seamlessly over the set. It was another typical episode of The View, the kind where the energy seems predictable, almost rehearsed. Then Robert De Niro arrived as a guest. His presence alone carried a weight that demanded attention. The veteran actor, a figure known for his intensity on screen and his outspoken commentary off it, sat down. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg, the experienced host, exuded her trademark blend of authority and charm, a moderator accustomed to controlling the ebb and flow of high-profile conversations. From the very first second, it was clear that this would not be an ordinary interview. De Niro's gaze was steady, his posture deliberate, a silent signal that he was ready to engage on more than just surface topics. The cameras, fixed and rolling, captured every subtle movement, every nuanced expression, and every flicker of tension that would soon fill the room. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. The narration begins, echoing the invitation to the audience to stay connected, to witness every detail of what was about to unfold. The episode opened with light conversation, touching briefly on De Niro's current projects, his reflections on cinema, and the cultural impact of his work. But beneath this measured beginning, the undertones of a more charged discussion were already present. The air in the studio shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, as the questions began to probe beyond the usual promotional chatter. The stakes of the moment became apparent not because of a single line, but because of the very presence of these two strong personalities on the same stage, each with a distinct sense of conviction and a willingness to speak unfiltered truth. Whoopi, aware of the actor's reputation, navigated the initial conversation with finesse. Her questions were designed to elicit insight without confrontation, to allow the discussion to breathe, and yet, in a way, to test the boundaries of De Niro's composure and willingness to push back. The tension was subtle but undeniable. Every glance, every pause, every carefully considered phrase was loaded with potential. The audience, though largely silent, seemed to sense it too. Their energy was quiet but expectant, a collective holding of breath waiting for the moment when the controlled surface would crack. As the dialogue progressed, it became evident that the conversation was moving beyond the superficial. A question regarding responsibility, accountability, and public influence arrived quietly, but with force. It was a question that might seem simple to the casual observer, but it held the power to challenge not just De Niro's opinions, but the dynamics of the entire panel. The way the question was framed, it demanded reflection, clarity, and a response that could not be delivered with mere pleasantries. The cameras caught the shift instantly. De Niro's posture subtly changed, his focus sharpened. Whoopi's expression, always carefully measured, hinted at anticipation, a readiness to see how this moment would unfold. The stakes were clear. This was live television. There would be no edits, no post-production cuts to smooth over awkward silences or hesitations. Everything was being broadcast to millions, every subtle inflection and pause fully visible, fully audible. The audience and the viewers at home were witnessing a genuine interaction, real-time test of control, conviction, and composure. And then the moment came. A line, a carefully placed question, shifted the energy completely. The room held its breath, the cameras lingered, and the words landed with undeniable impact. What followed was not loud or sensational. It was deliberate, measured, and profoundly revealing. De Niro responded, his voice steady, his words precise, laying out a perspective that carried both firmness and clarity. Whoopi listened intently, her expression unflinching, her responses calculated to maintain dialogue rather than escalate conflict. The subtle dance of tension and control was now fully underway. For the viewers, it was a glimpse into what live television can achieve when personalities of equal strength meet under a lens that captures every nuance. It was not about spectacle. It was about presence, about what happens when two forces of intellect and influence collide on a platform designed for conversation, but capable of exposing truth in its rawest form. Even in this early phase of the interview, the audience could feel the undercurrent of significance. This was more than a routine discussion. It was a moment that would resonate, a demonstration of how public discourse unfolds when personalities, experience, and conviction converge in real time. And as the camera panned back to include the reactions of the co-hosts, subtle gestures, shifts in posture, and brief pauses all hinted that something pivotal was imminent. Every second seemed to stretch longer than the last, holding the promise of confrontation, clarity, and insight. The episode had begun as ordinary television, but in those first few minutes, it had already become a study in tension, anticipation, and the quiet power of presence. The audience, the hosts, and the guest were all participants in an intricate exchange that could only be understood fully by watching the moment unfold without interruption. The narrative hinted at what was coming without revealing it entirely. The tension was not forced, it was natural, built through context, reputation, and the subtle interplay of personalities. And so, with every camera angle, every pause, every deliberate choice of words, the scene set itself up for the confrontation that would define the episode, ensuring that the viewers remained glued, wondering what would happen next. It was here, in these moments before the pivotal exchange, that the stakes of live television became most apparent. The audience was unknowingly witnessing not just a conversation, but a test of control, influence, and presence. One wrong word, one misstep, and the controlled environment could have fractured into visible tension. Yet the careful orchestration, both conscious and instinctive, by Niro and Goldberg maintained the balance, creating an electric anticipation that would hold the viewer in suspense until the exact moment of confrontation. And so the stage was set. The moment was near. What would happen next would not just define this episode, but leave an impression far beyond the studio walls, echoing through media discussions, social media commentary, and the public consciousness. The viewer was left with one irresistible question. How would these two formidable personalities navigate the collision of perspective and conviction under the unblinking eye of live television? And with that, the story was poised to unfold. In the days leading up to the interview, Robert De Niro was not simply another actor promoting a film. He was a public figure with a long record of speaking candidly about politics, media responsibility, and civic duty. Over the years, he had built a reputation not only as one of America's most respected performers, but as someone unafraid to express strong opinions in public forums. That history mattered. It followed him into every studio, onto every stage, and especially into a live broadcast format where reactions could not be softened or reframed after the fact. Whoopi Goldberg, meanwhile, occupied a different but equally powerful position. As moderator on The View, she had developed a style rooted in balance. Her role was not merely to ask questions, but to manage personalities, redirect tension, and maintain space for multiple perspectives. The show itself was designed as a forum for debate. It thrived on differing opinions, yet it also relied on a sense of structure and control. The host's responsibility was to prevent disagreement from turning into chaos. When news circulated that De Niro would appear on the program, there was quiet speculation about what direction the conversation might take. He had recently been vocal in public appearances, and his remarks in other interviews had generated headlines. Viewers familiar with his past statements knew that he rarely softened his views for comfort. That expectation added a layer of anticipation to the episode before it even aired. Behind the scenes, producers typically outline topics in advance. Guests are briefed. Hosts are prepared with questions that can guide discussion without derailing it. Yet even with preparation, live television carries unpredictability. Tone can shift unexpectedly. A single response can alter the rhythm of the segment. And when both guest and host are confident, experienced communicators, the potential for a defining moment increases. In the early portion of the episode, the exchange remained steady. De Niro spoke about his work, reflecting on the discipline of acting and the responsibility he feels towards storytelling. Whoopi listened, occasionally interjecting with thoughtful prompts. But there was an undercurrent, an awareness that the conversation might eventually move beyond cinema. That shift came gradually. A question about public influence opened the door. Not accusatory, not confrontational, but probing. It referenced the broader climate of public discourse and the responsibility that prominent figures carry when they speak. The phrasing was careful, yet its implications were unmistakable. It invited De Niro to consider the weight of his words beyond the screen. For viewers aware of his past comments at award shows and public events, the tension was subtle but present. Would he reaffirm those positions? Would he temper them? Or would he redirect the conversation entirely? The anticipation did not stem from drama, but from uncertainty. The co-hosts at the table contributed to the atmosphere. Some leaned forward slightly, signaling interest. Others maintained neutral expressions, waiting to see how the exchange would develop. Body language often speaks before words do, and in this moment, the collective posture of the panel hinted that they understood the sensitivity of the topic. De Niro responded thoughtfully at first, acknowledging that public figures inevitably influence opinion. His tone was calm, measured. But as the discussion continued, his language grew firmer. He emphasized personal conviction and the importance of speaking clearly when values are at stake. The words were deliberate, not heated, yet unmistakably direct. Whoopi's response reflected her role as moderator. She broadened the lens, suggesting that dialogue requires space for disagreement. Her phrasing suggested caution against framing issues in absolute terms. It was not a rebuttal so much as an expansion, an attempt to keep the conversation inclusive rather than polarized. At this stage, nothing had gone wrong. There were no raised voices, no interruptions. Yet the emotional pressure was increasing. The stakes were no longer about a film release or industry anecdotes. They were about principle. When discussions reach that level on live television, even subtle shifts become amplified. What made the moment especially compelling was its authenticity. There was no visible cue from producers to redirect. No commercial break cut in to relieve the pressure. The cameras remained steady, capturing every exchange in real time. For the audience at home, the experience felt immediate and unscripted. The history of The View includes many spirited debates, but each confrontation is shaped by the personalities involved. De Niro's presence altered the dynamic simply because of his reputation for intensity. His screen roles often depict controlled power, and that persona, whether fair or not, colors public perception. When he leans forward slightly or pauses before responding, viewers instinctively assign weight to the gesture. As the conversation edged closer to sensitive territory, a sense of inevitability emerged. It felt as though a defining question was approaching, one that would require more than a diplomatic answer. The pacing slowed. Pauses lengthened. Even casual viewers could sense that the next exchange might determine the tone of the remainder of the segment. The anticipation was not rooted in hostility. It was rooted in contrast. Two accomplished communicators, both confident, both articulate, representing different approaches to public discourse, were now aligned across a table under bright studio lights. The format demanded clarity. The audience expected substance. What heightened the pressure was the knowledge that live television offers no opportunity for revision. Every word would stand as spoken. Every pause would be interpreted. Social media reactions would begin before the segment ended. In that environment, even a measured disagreement can resonate far beyond the studio. As the build-up continued, Whoopi shifted her posture slightly and prepared to ask what would become the defining question of the interview. It was framed with composure, yet it carried the potential to challenge De Niro directly. The studio seemed to quiet instinctively, as though everyone present recognized that the conversation had reached its turning point. The path to confrontation had been gradual, built through context and subtle tension rather than abrupt conflict. The audience had been guided step by step from light discussion into deeper territory. And now, with cameras trained closely on both faces, the moment of truth was seconds away. What happened next would unfold without edits, without filters, and without the safety net of post-production. It would be a real-time exchange between two influential voices, each standing firmly in their perspective. The anticipation hung in the air, heavy but controlled. The stage had been carefully prepared. The stakes were understood. And as Whoopi began to speak, setting up the question that would define the segment, viewers across the country leaned in, aware that the next response might shift the entire atmosphere of the show. The question arrived without raised volume, without accusation, and without theatrics. Whoopi Goldberg delivered it calmly, her tone even, her expression composed. She asked Robert De Niro whether there is a line between passionate conviction and rhetoric that risks deepening division, and whether public figures bear responsibility for where that line is drawn. There was no music swell, no dramatic camera cut, just a quiet studio and a question that required precision. For a fraction of a second, De Niro did not answer. He looked at Whoopi directly, his posture still, his face unreadable. The pause was not long in measurable time, but on live television, even 2 seconds can feel extended. The cameras tightened slightly, capturing the subtle narrowing of his eyes as he considered the weight of the question. This was not about film anymore. It was not about awards or craft or career milestones. It was about influence, responsibility, accountability, and it was happening in real time. De Niro began slowly. He acknowledged that strong language can make people uncomfortable. He did not retreat from his past statements. Instead, he clarified that, In his view, discomfort is sometimes necessary when larger principles are involved. His voice remained steady. There was no visible agitation. Yet there was firmness, a refusal to dilute his perspective for the sake of smooth television. Whoopi listened without interruption. Her role required composure, and she maintained it. But her body language shifted slightly. She leaned back, folded her hands, and allowed him to finish completely before responding. That restraint itself communicated control. She was not attempting to overpower the moment. She was allowing it to unfold. The studio audience remained unusually quiet. No scattered applause. No audible reactions. The silence amplified the exchange. When Whoopi responded, she reframed the issue. She suggested that while conviction is valid, tone and framing matter in a fragmented public environment. Her words were measured, not accusatory. She emphasized dialogue over declaration, conversation over confrontation. Niro did not interrupt. He waited. Then he leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with intent. He reiterated that there are moments when neutrality feels irresponsible. He spoke about personal conscience, about drawing boundaries based on values rather than comfort. Again, silence followed. On pre-recorded television, silence can be trimmed. On live broadcast, it lingers. Viewers at home could see the tension not because voices were raised, but because neither participant softened their stance. There was mutual respect, but no retreat. One of the co-hosts shifted in her seat, glancing briefly between Niro and Whoopi. Another adjusted papers on the table, perhaps an unconscious attempt to release the pressure building in the room. The cameras captured these micro-movements, small signals that the atmosphere had changed. Whoopi posed a follow-up. Not confrontational, but pointed. She asked whether clarity must always be expressed in the strongest possible terms, or whether persuasion sometimes requires restraint. The question sharpened the moment. Niro answered directly. He explained that in his experience, strong conviction often demands clear language. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically, but his tone carried weight. His words were deliberate, paced, and unmistakably resolute. For a brief second, Whoopi held eye contact without speaking. It was a host's pause, one that acknowledged the gravity of what had been said while deciding how to move forward. That silence may have been the most revealing moment of the entire segment. There was no laughter to diffuse the tension, no pivot to lighter territory. The conversation existed exactly as it was, two experienced communicators presenting differing philosophies about public expression. What made the exchange powerful was not hostility. It was contrast. Niro represented unapologetic clarity. Whoopi represented structured dialogue. Neither dismissed the other. Neither escalated the tone. Yet the divergence in approach was unmistakable. The cameras cut briefly to a wide shot of the table, then back to a close-up. The editing, minimal and unobtrusive, underscored the reality that nothing was being concealed. This was live. Every second broadcast unfiltered. Another pause. Whoopi nodded slightly before responding. She acknowledged his perspective while reiterating her belief in keeping space open for varied voices. Her delivery was steady, composed, professional. She did not attempt to win the exchange. She aimed to sustain it. Niro's expression softened just slightly, not in concession, but in recognition that the conversation had reached its natural peak. The energy in the room, while still charged, began to settle. And yet, something had shifted permanently. The audience sensed it. Viewers at home sensed it. The segment had crossed from routine discussion into something more revealing. A study in how conviction and moderation coexist under the pressure of live broadcast. There were no explosive headlines generated in that instant. No shouting match. No walk-off. But the significance lay in what did not happen. Neither party backed down. Neither party lost control. They held their positions calmly, visibly, publicly. As the conversation edged toward transition, Whoopi glanced briefly at her notes. A subtle cue that the segment was approaching its end. Niro adjusted his posture, leaning back slightly for the first time since the exchange began. The moment had passed its most intense point, but its impact lingered. Live television rarely allows viewers to witness raw perspective without interruption. Here, there had been no safety net. The exchange unfolded exactly as it was spoken. No edits. No rewrites. No second takes. For those watching closely, the defining feature of the confrontation was not aggression. It was composure under scrutiny. And just as the tension began to ease, just as it seemed the segment might pivot back toward safer ground, One final exchange added a subtle but powerful note, a closing remark that reframed everything that had been said. To understand what that final shift meant, and how it changed the atmosphere inside the studio, you have to see what happened immediately after. 4 deeper breakdowns of moments like this, where live television reveals more than scripted dialogue ever could. Stay with the truth narrator. The transition out of the exchange was subtle, almost restrained. There was no abrupt cut to commercial, no nervous laughter to dissolve the tension. Instead, there was a measured breath across the table. Whoopi Goldberg glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to Robert De Niro, and offered a composed acknowledgement of his perspective. It was the kind of response that signals both closure and professionalism. But inside the studio, something had changed. The energy, once light and conversational, had shifted into something quieter and more reflective. The co-hosts adjusted in their seats, their expressions thoughtful rather than reactive. The audience, which had remained mostly silent during the peak of the exchange, offered polite applause when the conversation gently pivoted back toward De Niro's film work. It wasn't the enthusiastic kind that follows a punchline. It was respectful, measured. Whoopi resumed her role as moderator with visible control. She redirected the discussion toward the actor's current project, asking about the creative process and the themes explored in the film. Her tone was steady, unshaken. If there had been tension, she did not allow it to linger outwardly. That composure was part of her craft. Years of live television had trained her to absorb charged moments and move forward without spectacle. De Niro, for his part, mirrored that professionalism. He answered the new line of questions with clarity and calm. His voice returned to a conversational cadence. Yet even as the discussion shifted topics, the earlier exchange remained present in the atmosphere, not dominating it, but hovering just beneath the surface. Viewers at home likely sensed the difference. Live broadcasts carry emotional residue. When a serious moment occurs, even after the subject changes, the room feels altered. Body language remains slightly more restrained. Pauses stretch a fraction longer. The laughter, when it returns, arrives cautiously. In this case, what stood out most was what did not happen. There was no defensive retreat from De Niro. No visible frustration from Whoopi. No escalation into personal critique. Instead, both participants demonstrated a rare form of live discipline, the ability to disagree without destabilizing the platform. As the segment neared its conclusion, Whoopi offered De Niro an opportunity for a final thought. It was a small but meaningful gesture. The invitation signaled that, despite the pointed exchange earlier, his voice remained welcome. He responded briefly, reinforcing the importance of civic engagement and personal conviction, but in a tone that was less pointed than before, reflective rather than forceful. The cameras widened to include the full panel. Smiles returned, though more subdued than at the beginning of the episode. The audience applauded again as the segment wrapped. And then, just like that, the moment passed from live experience into recorded history. But once broadcast, live television does not simply disappear. Clips circulate. Discussions begin. Viewers replay moments, analyze expressions, interpret pauses. Within hours, short excerpts of the exchange began appearing across social media platforms. Some focused on De Niro's firmness. Others highlighted Whoopi's calm moderation. The framing varied depending on perspective, but one detail remained constant. It had happened live. Media outlets described the exchange as tense yet respectful. Commentators noted the absence of theatrics. In an era where televised debates often lean toward spectacle, this moment stood out precisely because it did not explode. It held steady. For De Niro, the interview reinforced his public identity as someone unwilling to dilute his views. It did not introduce a new controversy, nor did it significantly alter his reputation. Instead, it reaffirmed a pattern, direct speech delivered without apology. For Whoopi Goldberg, the moment underscored her role as a steady presence at the center of unpredictable conversations. Moderating live television requires both listening and guiding, and in that exchange, she managed both without visible strain. In the days that followed, analysis of the segment emphasized its tone rather than its content. Observers pointed out how rare it is for two strong voices to remain composed under visible tension. There were no viral outbursts, no dramatic exits, no interruptions that spiraled beyond control. Instead, there was a study in balance. The cultural significance of the moment lies less in the specific words spoken and more in the demonstration of how disagreement, can unfold publicly without collapsing into hostility. In a polarized media landscape, viewers are often accustomed to sharper edges, raised voices, clipped interruptions, sensational headlines. Here, the intensity came from contrast rather than chaos. Live television is unforgiving. It captures hesitation, certainty, and emotion in equal measure. In that studio, on that day, the cameras recorded something simple, yet increasingly rare. Two influential figures holding firm positions while maintaining mutual respect. As the episode faded into the next segment, the studio lights remained just as bright. The audience filed out eventually, carrying with them the memory of a moment that felt significant without being explosive. For some viewers, it was confirmation of Niro's unwavering stance. For others, it was evidence of Whoopi's steady leadership at the table. For many, it was simply compelling television, the kind that does not rely on spectacle to leave an impression. The impact of that exchange still resonates because it reflects a broader question about public discourse. How do strong personalities navigate live platforms responsibly? How does conviction coexist with moderation? Those questions extend beyond one episode of The View. They speak to the evolving nature of televised dialogue itself. Moments like this endure not because they shock, but because they reveal. They show the mechanics of influence, the weight of words, and the discipline required to speak under constant scrutiny. In a single live broadcast, viewers witnessed not just a disagreement, but a demonstration of composure. If you value in-depth breakdowns of live television moments that shape public perception, subscribe to The Truth Narrator. Like this video, share your perspective in the comments, and join the conversation as we continue examining the intersections of media, influence, and accountability. Because sometimes the most powerful confrontations are not the loudest. They are the ones that unfold quietly, under bright lights, with millions watching, and leave a lasting imprint long after the cameras stop rolling.